All right, so you're ready to start calculating your ANOVA, and as we said in the previous little video, the first step is to determine the sum of squares. And in this case, you have to determine sum of squares within, sum of squares between, and sum of squares total. Now, what I've done here on this whiteboard is to write out the numbers in the way that you should do for yourself at the top of the paper that you're using for calculating sum of squares within, sum of squares between, and sum of squares total. Organization is absolutely key, and it's very important that you can see how all these numbers lay out. I've copied these numbers out of your textbook, and let's just review very quickly what each of these numbers mean. It should be very straightforward. This is the sum of the x's for group 1, and that equals 98. If you square each of the individual x's for group 1 and then add those together, you have sum of the x's squared, and that's 978 for this group. For group 2, the sum of the x's, the sum of the 10 individual scores from group 2 is 74. If you square each of those individual values and then add together the squared values, you get sum of the x's squared for group 2 is 584. And then for group 3, the sum of the x's is 71, and the sum of the x's squared is 541. Now, you want to go ahead and calculate the mean for each of these groups. You have 3 groups, 3 means. The mean of group 1 is 98 divided by 10, 9.80, 74 divided by 10, 7.40, 71 divided by 10. The number of subjects in the group, 7.10. Your total sample size is 30. The number of groups that you have in this ANOVA is 3. If you add together all of the x's from all of the groups, you have the sum of the x's total, and that's 98 plus 74 plus 71, 243. If you add together all of the sum of the x's squared for all of the groups, so that's sum of the x's squared total, you get 978 plus 584 plus 541 equals 2,103. Now, there are additional values that are very useful to calculate at this point. It'll make the coming calculations a little bit easier to have this already done. And here what you want to do is you want to square the x sum values, right? So you want to square 98, and that's 9,604. And you want to square 74, and that's 5,476. And you want to square 71. And that's 5,041. Okay, now having these values laid out in this way, in this very organized way, is going to help you in the calculation of your sum of squares within, sum of squares between, and sum of squares total. So let's start with sum of squares within and make sure that we're very clear on what each of these symbols refers to, which value each of these refers to. And once you know the value that each of these symbols refers to, the calculations are extremely simple. So don't let yourself get thrown by all the symbols. First, we have sum of the x's squared for group 1. Sum of the x's squared for group 1 is 978, right? And we take that, from that we subtract the sum of the x's, the square of the sum of the x's, which is 9,604, divided by the group size, little n 1, which is 10. And then we're going to do the same thing for group 2. Sum of the x's squared, 584, minus, let's put that parenthesis in there, the squared sum of the x's value, 5,476, divided by 10, plus the sum of the x's squared, which is 541, minus the sum of the x's squared value, 5,041, Let's try to make that 0 a little bit more of a 0. Divided by 10, right? Okay, so that's pretty easy because now we have, let's put this down, 978 minus 960.4 plus 584 minus 547.6 plus 541 minus 504.1. All right, and if you calculate that through, and let's just do that together, 978 minus 960.4 equals 17.6 plus 584 minus 547.6 equals 36.4 plus 541 minus 504.1 equals 36.9. And if you just total together those values, you get 90.9. So your sum of squares within for this problem is 90.9. Now I want to point out something. While we had lots of symbols and lots of steps, all of this was extremely easy math, right? All right, so 90.9 is our sum of squares within value. We're just going to take this away so we can now calculate sum of squares between. And let's just write 90.9 up here. And go on to sum of squares between. All right, now the formula for sum of squares between that will reveal to you most clearly what's happening is probably this formula. And here you just take sum of the x's from group 1 squared divided by sample size. Let me do this a little bit differently so we have enough room here. Okay, sum of squares between. All right, make this a little bit bigger. Sum of the x's from group 1 squared divided by the n of 1, right? Plus, the same for each group, sum of the x's from group 2 squared divided by n2 plus sum of the x's group 3 squared divided by n3. And then from this we subtract the sum of the x's total. And sum of the x's total squared divided by the total sample size. All right, so let's go ahead and calculate that through. So we have, using your values that you have in front of you, that we could also get from the previous board, 5,476 divided by 10 plus 5,041 divided by 10 minus, and this sum of the x's total we had over here. If you square 243 and 243, you get 59,049 divided by the total sample size, right? And now we just calculate that through, and of course this is 960.4 plus 547.6 plus 504.1. We're going to add those together and then subtract 59049 divided by 30. Sorry about that. Minus, let's go ahead and calculate that through. That's 1,968 0.3. All right, and let's just do this. 960.4 plus 547.6 plus 504.1, that's 2012.1 minus 1968.3, and you get 43.8. So sum of squares between equals 43.80. All right, again, not so hard. Once you know what each of these figures, if you're very clear what each of these symbol figures are referring to, the actual calculations are easy. So 43.80 is our sum of squares between, and let's just write that at the top. Okay. Very good. And now sum of squares total is relatively simple formula compared to the rest of those, right? So here we have sum of the x's squared total, which we have on our other board, minus sum of the x's total and the squared value for that divided by big N, the total sample size, right? So this one, we have 2,103, as you can look at on your paper, or you can just get from right here, right? Minus the sum of the x's total, 243 squared. So let's put this in your, as it is in your book, squared divided by 30, right? And so that ends up being 2103 minus 1968. Notice 0.30. Notice you figured this already in the previous calculation, so your sum of squares total equals 134.70, right? You see where that came from? Relatively easy calculations, right? It's just a lot of steps. And when you have a lot of steps, it's very, very important to stay very organized. It makes it much, much simpler. All right, so now you have your sum of squares within and your sum of squares between and your sum of squares total. Now in the next little video clip, I'll go through how to calculate your mean square errors using these values.